Over the last 50 years or so, there's been an incredible sea change in attitudes towards race. So 50, 60 years ago, for example, something like 80% of people would endorse stereotypes about black and Asian people. At the turn of the millennium, that had fallen to about 10%. In the 1960s and 1970s, a very high proportion of people in Britain would have had difficulty with one of their children marrying a minority or with a minority moving next door to them. But by the 1990s, very few people expressed any anxiety about these things. So there's been this incredible, very positive change in terms of racial attitudes. And that's led some people to kind of conclude that racism is dying out, that it's being eradicated. And it was just something I wanted to test out and to investigate further. And in doing so, discovered that racism isn't being eliminated, but that it's like a virus. It's evolved, it's transformed, it's become something different. So the way we thought of racism in the past, by psychologists is referred to as old-fashioned racism. Modern racism is very different from old-fashioned racism. It's less direct, it's less obvious, it's more subtle. And as a consequence, perpetrators of racist acts may not even be aware that they're doing them, but the people on the receiving end are aware of the fact that they are being treated differently. More recently, with the presidential elections in the United States and the EU referendum in the United Kingdom, there's been very charged debates about immigration and about minorities generally, which has led to a rise in racist acts in public, which is kind of a new format of old-fashioned racism. The difference today compared to the past is that those acts are being challenged far more vigorously than they ever were before. And I expect that that very overt racism will actually kind of reduce. The modern racism, though, lingers because it's difficult to detect, and as a consequence, we're not challenging it. In fact, some people are not challenging it because they think racism is on the way out in any case. The impact that racism has in organisations actually depends on the ethnic group that you're talking about. So when we talk about minorities, we kind of lump all these different ethnic groups together without any consideration that the treatment that they're receiving could actually be different. What the book demonstrates is that there is a hierarchy, and this hierarchy applies to many different countries. Essentially, it's white people at the top, black people at the bottom, and everybody else in between. Now that's the basic hierarchy, and how the groups are described and what they're composed of will differ according to the society that we're discussing. So the impact racism has will be different for each of these different groups. Black groups, for example, they will find themselves in less prestigious roles, less well-paid roles. They will be less likely to be promoted, etc. The groups in the middle, for example, in the United Kingdom, Asian groups, are seen as well-educated and will find themselves in technical roles, but are far less likely, for example, to be found in sales positions. But also there's lingering doubts about Asian people, the stereotypical views about Asian people, there are doubts about their leadership capabilities. So despite their presence in well-paid roles in the specialist technical areas, they are far less likely to be promoted into the most senior positions. So the impact that racism has differs according to the group that you're talking about. There are also differences according to whether you're a male in a minority group and a female in a minority group. So the impact of this is actually different according to the groups you're talking about and the gender that we're talking about too. But generally speaking, it has an impact in all of the key decision points in organisations. Who do we attract? Who do we select? How do we induct them? How do we treat them? What sort of performance evaluations do we arrive at for them? And who do we promote? It's kind of all of those areas are the key decision points. But in addition to that, there's the treatment that we give to people, that we dole out to people in teams, the interactions that we have on a daily basis. How do we treat people? Are there in-groups and out-groups within our own teams and our own organisations? Those daily interactions are also affected by the stereotypical views that we may hold about different groups. You might think that racial inequality will be more apparent in some sectors and some organisations than others. I have 3 case studies in the book, one about race and football, one about race and accountancy, and the third one looking at race and the Oscars. And in many respects, it was writing the case studies that made me realise that there was a book here. Now, everybody kind of expected and weren't surprised by the fact that there is racism in football. What was more surprising was that there was similar forms of racism, maybe not so overt, operating within the accountancy profession. These are the big accountancy firms. And essentially the pattern was the same. So at the entry level, so footballers and graduate accountants, at that entry level there's a lot of diversity. As you move further up through the ranks, in football it might be coaching, and in director roles, in accountancy it'd be more the director roles and the partnership positions, the diversity starts to disappear. It was the same in both. And actually you look at the experiences of people in those professions. In football, overt racism is no longer acceptable. There is a reaction, sometimes might even argue an overreaction to the racist incidents that are witnessed, but there's very little attention paid to the fact that there are hardly any black coaches and directors of football, despite the fact something like 25% of professional footballers are black. It's a similar position in the accountancy profession. Something like 45% of people studying accountancy are from minority groups, typically Asian, but there are hardly any minorities who are partners in firms. And then their treatment within both of those sectors, they experience the fact that that they're being treated differently, but it's difficult to put the fingers on it because it's very subtle. The situations are ambiguous. So the acts of racism aren't so overt, but people are sensing they are being treated differently in whatever sector we're looking at. Part of the reason why there's still so much racial inequality in organisations is that we don't like talking about the subject. We don't like talking about racial prejudice in organisations. I've actually had directors of diversity and inclusion of major corporations telling me that in their organisations they don't think that race is a factor anymore. And it's that kind of ignorance of the experience of minorities in their own organisations and their willingness to accept the view that racism has been eradicated means that we're not even addressing it anymore. And the other reason why, connected to this, why racism lingers is actually we still carry the stereotypes around with us. We all carry stereotypes of different groups around with us, and for some groups of people the stereotypes are more positive than negative, and for other groups they're more negative than positive. And unless we are prepared to have a discussion about the impact of stereotypes and how they affect decisions that are made within organisations, then we're not going to make any more progress towards eradicating racism within organisations. The book's not just a description of the problems, but there is a lot of detail about what psychology tells us about the way people interact with one another, the way we view one another, the stereotypes and attitudes we hold about different groups. There's also a lot of advice to organisations about what we can do to help reduce racial inequality within organisations. I think the most powerful thing that I discovered, I think, during the course of writing the book is that context matters. So you may have individuals who hold prejudiced views, and we all hold prejudiced views to some extent, but actually the environment in which we work has an enormous impact in terms of whether those attitudes we hold impact the decisions that we make. And in terms of setting that context up, leaders play an enormous role here. They have a very important, significant role. Their attitudes towards diversity and equality in organisations sets the tone for everybody else's behaviour within the organisation. So leaders need to pay attention to this. They can't ignore this, and they can't pretend that race doesn't exist within their own organisations. It's something that they need to attend to. They need to make people aware of the fact that they are responsible for the decisions they make, and they need to keep that pressure on individuals to be fair at all times. Now, when that pressure is removed and where leaders change and so the focus changes, you actually find that discrimination increases. So context is really important. In addition to that, we can look at our processes, and there are lots of recommendations that the psychology research tells us about the way we can improve our processes and to make them fairer. But at an individual level, we need to recognise that we are all biased in some shape or form. We are all biased, and we need to take responsibility for our own biases, to examine them further and to try and find ways of working with other people which eliminates our biases, to receive feedback in terms of our own behaviour and the decisions that we make, and also being prepared to give feedback to other people. So there's lots of things in the book about what we can do, and a lot of the things are extremely straightforward if we can be bothered to do them. I've written several books in the past, but the last 3, including this one, have all been about bias. So The Value of Difference was about unconscious bias generally within organisations. The Invention of Difference was about gender bias in organisations, and this book, Racism at Work, The Danger of Indifference, is about race bias in organisations. It was never intended to be a series. I didn't set out with a plan to write 3 books about bias. But as I learnt more and just found out more about the way people discuss bias in organisations, I just feel that there's a need to discuss specific biases in more detail. There's a danger that we kind of think that bias is bias and it operates in exactly the same way for whatever group we're talking about. It doesn't. So gender bias is different from race bias. Actually, gender bias can impact race bias as well. There's kind of the interconnections, the intersectionality issues which all come into play. And it kind of made me feel that there was another book that needed to be written, and hence this book on racism in organisation. So I just wanted to write something which was specifically around the issue of race, incorporating issues of gender within that, because the way they interact, the way they interrelate, has particular resonances within organisations which I think it is valuable to raise and debate and discuss within organisations.